In the summer of 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte, master of Europe, led an army of over 600,000 men to conquer Russia. He figured it'd take him about 5 weeks. He was wrong. Of the 500,000 soldiers who marched into Russia, only a tiny fraction would ever see home again. But they weren't just defeated by the Russian army. They were conquered by a combination of vast distances, scorched earth, and a final ruthless enemy: the Russian winter. This is the story of how that campaign shattered the greatest army of its age and Napoleon's ambitions forever. By 1812, Napoleon basically was Europe. From Spain to Poland, his word was law. He'd humbled ancient empires, redrawn the entire map of the continent, and put his family on foreign thrones. The man wasn't just a general. He was a phenomenon, a military genius whose ambition seemed as bottomless as his talent. But there was one stubborn island that just wouldn't bend the knee: Great Britain. Protected by the most powerful navy in the world, Britain was safe from a direct invasion. So, Napoleon got creative. He decided to wage economic war, creating the continental system, a massive, continent-wide embargo that banned any nation in his sphere from trading with the British. Napoleon's logic was simple. If he could strangle Britain's trade, he'd wreck its economy and force it to beg for peace. But for the system to really work, everyone had to play along. In one country, the vast Russian Empire was cheating. There's Alexander I, once Napoleon's ally, had reopened trade with the British, openly defying the emperor's decree. For Napoleon, this was a personal and political betrayal he simply couldn't ignore. His response was the Grandearmée. It was the largest European army ever assembled, with more than 600,000 men from every corner of his empire. French, Polish, German, Italian, and Dutch soldiers all marched together. As this behemoth gathered on Russia's borders in June 1812, nobody, least of all Napoleon, doubted the outcome. He'd beaten the Russians before. This time he figured one big, decisive battle would bring the Tsar to his knees. His entire plan rested on a deadly assumption: a quick victory, with his massive army living off the fertile lands of Western Russia. He had dangerously underestimated the sheer scale of the country he was about to invade, and completely ignored its most powerful hidden weapon.
Ow!
On June 24, 1812, the Grandearmée crossed the Niemen River into Russia. They were ready for the glorious battle Napoleon had promised. Instead, they found nothing. The Russian armies, led by Berkeley de Tolly, simply refused to fight. They just retreated day after day, week after week, pulling the French deeper and deeper into the endless Russian plains. And as they fell back, they burned everything: torched villages, destroyed crops, and poisoned wells. This scorched earth strategy was brutal but brilliant. It turned the land itself into an enemy, denying Napoleon's army the food and supplies it so desperately needed. The summer was brutal and hot. Diseases like typhus and dysentery swept through the French ranks, killing more men than any battle. The army, built for a lightning-fast campaign, was now crawling across a barren, hostile landscape, its supply lines stretched to the breaking point. By the time they reached Smolensk in August, the Grandearmée had already lost over 100,000 men without fighting a single major battle. Finally, on September 7th, near a little village called Borodino, the Russians turned to fight. Their new commander, the wily old Mikhail Kutuzov, knew he couldn't just give up Moscow without a fight. What came next was the single bloodiest day of the Napoleonic Wars. For 12 straight hours, hundreds of thousands of men clashed in a hellstorm of cannon fire and bayonet charges. By sundown, the battlefield was a nightmarish landscape of death. The French had technically won, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. It suffered around 30,000 casualties, including 49 generals, weapons Napoleon couldn't afford to lose. The Russian army, though savaged with an estimated 44,000 casualties, had simply withdrawn in good order, ready to fight another day. A week later, Napoleon marched into Moscow, the ancient capital, but the victory felt ... empty. The city was a ghost town. He expected a delegation of city fathers to offer their surrender. Instead, he got silence. Then, that night, the fires started. Set by Russian agents, the flames consumed the city, destroying the very shelters and supplies Napoleon had been counting on for winter. For 5 agonizing weeks, Napoleon waited in a charred, empty city, sending peace offers to the Tsar that were never answered. He was the master of a ruined capital, hundreds of miles from friendly territory, with his army bleeding strength every single day. As he waited, the first snowflakes began to fall. The first snows in Moscow were a chilling omen of what was to come. The mild autumn weather that had tricked Napoleon into a false sense of security was officially over. With no peace treaty in sight and his position growing more desperate by the day, he finally gave the order he'd put off for far too long. On October 19th, the retreat began. The grandearmée, now shrunk to about 100,000 men, started the long march out of Moscow. Their plan was to head back on a more southerly route, through untouched countryside, rich with supplies. But at the Battle of Maloyar-Slavets, Kutuzov's revitalized Russian army blocked them, forcing Napoleon back onto the very same road they had destroyed on their way in. It was a death sentence. They were now retreating through a desert of their own making. Discipline, the foundation of Napoleon's army, began to dissolve almost at once. The retreat turned into a chaotic, stumbling column of individuals. Soldiers broke from their units, desperate to find any scrap of food. They became easy targets for the Cossack cavalry who haunted the column relentlessly, appearing like ghosts to strike down stragglers before melting back into the forests. Then, in early November, the real enemy arrived. The temperature plunged. Within days, it dropped to -30 degrees Celsius, -22 degrees Fahrenheit. The soldiers, many still in their tattered summer uniforms, were completely unprepared. The horses, which hadn't been fitted with proper shoes for the ice, slipped and died by the thousands. Their deaths were a double disaster. It wiped out the cavalry and forced the army to abandon its cannons and supply wagons. They were left with no food and no artillery. The once mighty Grande was now little more than a disorganized mob shuffling through the snow, fighting not for glory but just to stay alive. This wasn't a military retreat anymore. It was a flight from a frozen hell. The suffering was on a scale that's hard to even imagine. The cold was a physical, relentless predator. Men's breath froze into ice crystals. Exposed skin would freeze in moments. Soldiers who sat down to rest simply froze to death, discovered like statues in the morning snow. Frostbite was everywhere. Men lost noses, fingers, and toes. Many had shoes that had long since fallen apart, and they were forced to walk with their feet wrapped in rags. Survivors spoke of watching the skin and muscle peel away from the bones of their feet. Starvation was an even greater torment. They had already eaten their horses. They resorted to boiling scraps of leather from their gear, and in the darkest moments, there were even reports of cannibalism. Men would kill their own comrades for a piece of bread or a warmer coat. The bonds of fellowship that hold an army together were completely dissolved by desperation, and through it all, there were the Cossacks. They never risked a full-scale battle, but they were a constant, terrifying presence on the flanks, their lances picking off the exhausted and the weak. Every man who fell behind was a dead man. The lowest point came in late November, the crossing of the borodino River, the remnants of the army around 49,000 soldiers, and another. 40,000 stragglers found their path blocked by the icy, swollen river and a converging Russian army. In a final, incredible feat of engineering, Dutch pontoon soldiers waded into the freezing water to build makeshift bridges. What followed was pure chaos. As the desperate crowd tried to cross, Russian artillery opened fire, turning the riverbanks into a slaughterhouse. People were trampled in the stampede, or pushed from the bridges into the freezing water below. To save the core of the army, the bridges were eventually set on fire, abandoning tens of thousands on the other side to be killed or captured. The word borodino even entered the French language as a synonym for a total disaster. Amidst this horror, one man became a legend, Marshal Ney. Commanding the rearguard, Ney fought with the ferocity of a lion, rallying small groups of men to hold back the Russians, often fighting with a musket himself. He was called the bravest of the brave, the last hero of a dying army. This story is a powerful reminder of how even the greatest ambitions can be humbled by forces far beyond our control. If you love getting lost in these incredible, dramatic moments from the past, make sure you subscribe and hit the bell icon so you don't miss our next exploration of history. On December 5th, with what was left of his army near Vilnius, Napoleon did the unthinkable. He abandoned them. Racing ahead in a sled, he sped back to Paris to secure his political power and raise a new army, leaving his men to die in the snow. The final numbers are just staggering. Of the more than 600,000 men who entered Russia, only about 27,000 from the main army managed to stumble back across the Niemen River. While some estimates of total survivors are higher when including auxiliary units, the result was the same. The Grande Armée had been effectively annihilated. Its soldiers were killed in battle, taken prisoner, or died of disease, starvation, and cold. The Russians, too, had suffered immensely, with perhaps 200,000 of their own soldiers killed. The disastrous Russian campaign didn't just stop Napoleon. It shattered the myth of his invincibility. Seeing the emperor so catastrophically defeated, the nations of Europe, Austria, Sweden smelled blood. They were emboldened to rise up together in a new coalition, the war that would eventually lead to Napoleon's defeat at Leipzig and his first abdication. The road to Waterloo truly began in the frozen plains of Russia. Napoleon Bonaparte, the master of Europe, had conquered armies, kings, and empires. But in the end, he was broken by the vastness of Russia and the merciless power of its winter.